There we go. We are now recording. All right. Fabulous. It's great to see all of you. I hope you've had a great week. I hope you're having a great Thursday. And so now let's turn to the book. Let's turn to one of the books that made Foucault famous. He is famous for many of them, but this was really the one that made him a superstar. And this is the book that has kind of affected so many different disciplines of thought. And so this is the book. So what's going on in Foucault's Discipline and Punish? If we had to identify a kind of thesis, a kind of a project mission statement, a project thesis, or a thesis, what's going on in the book? Foucault claims that the Enlightenment ideas, techniques, and strategies, okay, these three strategies that we've already talked about, Foucault claims that these three techniques or strategies that were originally designed for the modern prison and army are representative of a group of strategies and techniques that have been deployed throughout Enlightenment society, right? And what Foucault is going to do in the book, and this is why it's such a, in some ways, it's such a strange book, and in other ways, and at the same time, it's so fascinating, in some ways, brilliant. What Foucault is going to do in the book is he's going to tell us a history story, a kind of history story about the emergence of the modern prison, about modern punishment. He's going to tell us a history story about the emergence and the development of modern punishment and the modern prison system. And he's going to use that story as a kind of vehicle for the analysis of the way that these three strategies, the total control and routinization of space and time, the creation of architecture that is designed to maximize the observation of the people in it and to induce in those people the awareness that they're always being watched. That's called panopticism. And then three, the creation and deployment of this almost infinite system of exams that are designed to acquire knowledge, understand why things break down, and how to fix them, right? Foucault is going to use the emergence of the modern system of punishment and the modern prison system, and by extension, the modern army, the modern military, to show how these three techniques, which were, and again, this is kind of funny, which were originally designed for the prison, right? These three techniques and strategies that we're talking about, that Foucault calls disciplinary power, as they operate independently and reinforce each other, right? These three techniques, they were originally designed for the emergence of the modern punishment and prison system in the Enlightenment. That's their origin. And they were originally designed and deployed, not just in the modern prison, but in the army. And then here's the kind of the hook of the book. Those techniques and strategies, control and routinization of time and space, surveillance, examinations, those techniques and strategies that Foucault calls disciplinary power, that were designed for the emergence of the modern punishment and prison system in the Enlightenment, were so successful that they were deployed throughout Enlightenment society itself. That's the thesis. So Foucault is going to tell us a story about the origin of the modern / enlightenment system or vision or system of punishment. How and why do we punish people? How and why do we imprison people? What's the goal? All right? He's going to tell us the story of the Enlightenment, how the Enlightenment account of how we punish and imprison people and why, how that account emerged in the modern prison, and how it was in a way so successful, like these strategies were so successful that they in this way became deployed throughout society. Which means, in this kind of ironic way, this kind of joyfully ironic way, that the origin, the laboratory, the origin for Enlightenment society wasn't some utopian society, it was the prison. The laboratory, the origin of what we now call Enlightenment society was the modern prison. All right? A set of strategies that were specifically designed to articulate what modern punishment is, what modern imprisonment is, and why we do it. That's the key, why we do it. A series of strategies designed in the Enlightenment, this new narrative. Those strategies become so successful, so good at doing what they're supposed to do, in a way, that they are adopted, they are deployed throughout society. They're deployed in elementary schools, they're deployed in boarding homes, they're deployed in hospitals, they're deployed in factories, they're deployed in universities, they're deployed in large bureaucracies. So the thesis it's a wild thesis. On the one hand, Foucault's just telling you this kind of historical account, it's a history book, about the emergence of the modern Enlightenment notion of punishment, imprisonment, and why we do it. It's kind of telling you this story. And he's telling you the story about these three strategies that emerged to do it. But the hook is that these strategies weren't just deployed in the prison. They were deployed everywhere. They were deployed, again, in hospitals, in elementary schools, in universities, in bureaucracies, in factories, boarding homes, right? And so the Enlightenment society is a kind of open-air prison. It's a kind of open-air prison. So the main idea driving Foucault's book is the claim that the modern Enlightenment ideas and techniques of punishment and rehabilitation that were developed for the modern prison and army are representative of a group of strategies and techniques that Foucault calls disciplinary power, and that these techniques have been deployed throughout society itself. They are everywhere, they're ubiquitous. And that's why we were playfully saying last week, prisons and schools and hospitals and factories, they all kind of look the same. They function the same. In fact, Enlightenment society is just a kind of open air prison. As we said on Tuesday, for Foucault, consciousness is a kind of phenomenon where you are both prisoner in and guard over your own consciousness. So Foucault is going to tell the story about the emergence of the modern Enlightenment, prison, punishment, prison, and reasons for this, the rehabilitation of the criminal, as a kind of vehicle, for an analysis of Enlightenment society itself. Now, at the end of the day, what's really profound or traumatic about this is that then, okay, I see that that's going on. And then you think, well, Foucault's a postmodern, right? Foucault's a postmodern. And as we said on Tuesday, for postmodernists, there is no objectively true subjectivity. There's no objectively true self or subjectivity. And so when you add this kind of analysis of the three primary strategies that emerged from the Enlightenment, this control of routinization of space and time, architecture and surveillance, panopticism, and at the end of the day, all these examinations, right? And how those things have been deployed throughout society. If you add to that this kind of postmodern sort of realization that those things are functioning to construct certain types of people, right? It's constructing, disciplinary power is constructing subjectivity, right? It's constructing our subjectivity. Whoever we are is not something that's objectively true, right? It's something that is kind of fabricated, kind of constructed, kind of made, kind of all, designed in a kind of linguistic / material space of power relationships, disciplinary power. So, right? Therefore, the original model laboratory for the creation and control of what we call the Enlightenment society was the prison. We are literally constructed to be economically efficient, politically docile, right? And we live in a kind of space, a socio-political, economic, intellectual space that's reversed the flow of visibility. We're all visible, we're all being watched, we've internalized it. And at the end of the day, we're prisoners in and guards over our own consciousness. So we're literally a kind of open air prison. And in fact, in this kind of ironic turn of events for Foucault, in a weird way, in a playful way, not a little, in a weird way, actual inmates in prison, in a weird way, are more free than you and I. Because at least they know are being restricted. We're running around not thinking we're being restricted, right? We think we're free. It's just the opposite. All right, so how does he do this, right? How does he get this entire project going? And he opens this book with this extraordinary rhetorical move, right? To kind of one, demonstrate this broader idea that whatever discourses are, right? Whatever discourses are, these kind of systems of thought that possess their own internal logic and system meaning and system of meaning, value, and purpose. Whatever these discourses are, right? Nietzsche would call them poems. They are not in some way linear and progressive. They're not connected to any objective sort of movement. Discourses, you have different discourses historically. You have a kind of a New Testament Christian discourse. He's going to talk about a kind of a feudal aristocratic discourse. And then you have the emergence of this Enlightenment discourse. And in an attempt to demonstrate how discourses really possess their kind of own internal and coherent set of meanings, and that what happens in history, that discourses kind of fade away and new ones emerge. What Nietzsche would call, these kind of emerging, these poems after a poem after a poem, these kind of conflict, historical conflict over meaning, value, and purpose in poems. And some poems die off, and new narratives, new poems, new discourses emerge. Foucault wants to kind of tell and demonstrate that story, right? And so to do that, he sets up this really kind of bold juxtaposition between what he calls these two discourses, right? And one we could just for purposes of the class, kind of call this feudal aristocratic discourse. And he talks about the execution of this guy named Damien the Regicide. And he talks about this execution of this guy named Damien. And it's shocking. It's designed to be shocking on many levels. And he talks about it in the first 4 pages. And then he shifts very abruptly, page 4, page 5 or something, to this kind of schedule of the boys' home. This very Enlightenment, organized, routinized sort of schedule of the boys' home. Our schedules. It's a vehicle for our schedules. And so why is he doing this, right? The first thing to pay attention to is the way Foucault opens up the first 5 pages of the book, right? And Foucault wants to tell the story of 2 radically different discourses, right? And he does this, right, as a way of demonstrating the differences between and the emergence of different discourses or paradigms of thought, right? And again, the important thing here is that he wants to demonstrate that systems of thought, one, they're not objectively true, and they're not kind of objectively and rationally progressive or linear, right? That history is really a kind of battle between these different discourses, right? And it's not as if they're getting anywhere objectively true or closer to kind of some objective truth, right? And as we'll see in this kind of way he sets up the book, for Foucault and for the postmodernists, discourses are kind of fairly coherent systems of thought that possess their own internal justifications for meaning, value, and purpose of all things, right? Again, what Nietzsche would call sort of poems or narratives, right? And the important thing about the opening of the book and the important thing about postmodernism in general is that Foucault argues that what we see in the transition from a sort of feudal aristocratic discourse on punishment, what we see in the transition from a kind of feudal aristocratic discourse on punishment, in this case, we'll talk about it in a second, this execution of Damien, this torture and execution of Damien, right? And what we see in that discourse and the emergence of this new Enlightenment discourse, right, that we see in the story of the modern prison that he's going to tell, right, is not a rational and linear example of human thought and society progressing towards a greater truth, right? And this is important for postmodernism, right? He's gonna compare, right, these 2 radically different discourses about punishment. Generally, right? He's going to tell the story about Damien, who tried to kill the king, and what they did to him. And then he's going to tell the story about the emergence of the modern Enlightenment system of punishment and rehabilitation. And the normal thing for us as the heirs of the Enlightenment, the story we tell ourselves about that transition was, oh, well, we're just so much more humane. We're just so much more rational, we're just so much more humane, we're just so much more progressive, right? We see that transition from the execution and the torture of Damien to how we punish and how we rehabilitate. We see that transition as one of a kind of a kind of a superior, rational, progressive, objective mode of thought, just getting better, getting more humane, getting more just, getting more rational. And Foucault is going to say that's, first of all, that's not accurate, right? Because there is no objective truth to go to, right, in this kind of postmodern sense. And also, too, as we will see when we unpack these stories, that these discourses have their own internal set of logic. They have their own internal set of meaning, value, and purposes. So the opening part of the book is quite dramatic, and it's intended to make a quite serious point. And of course, to set up then what becomes disciplinary power, what becomes the whole emergence of the modern Enlightenment notion of punishment, incarceration, and most importantly, rehabilitation. So let's talk about it. Let's just have some fun, right? Let's get into this. So the book opens in a really, really grotesque way. All right, Foucault tells the story of a guy named Damien, some peasant. All right, some guy named Damien, some peasant, who, for whatever reason, we don't know. And again, all of these things will become important later on, right? Some guy named Damien, some peasant, don't know much about him, for reasons we have no idea about and never will, decided to kill the king, to attempt to kill the king. And he failed, obviously, and he's captured. And Foucault tells this story about what happens to him. And this story is a kind of an example of this kind of feudal aristocratic account of punishment, but it also functions as a kind of an account of a whole socio-politic, religious, punishment, moral discourse, right? The story he tells us is really a kind of a vehicle for a whole discourse. And so Damien gets caught, all right? And as is customary under this discourse, he's kind of caught and he's sentenced to be viciously tortured and executed publicly, right? And Foucault goes through great detail about how this was going to happen, right? And so Foucault says this, you know, they were going to, they sort of developed this entire sort of program. They had these special knives that they were gonna, and that they had designed, and these kind of pincers, and they were gonna cut open his arms, all of his muscles. They're gonna kind of strap him up, right? And they were gonna cut him open. And they had these special pincers that they had made, and they were going to pull back the flesh, right, exposing the tendon and the bone. And then they went to the apothecary, and they had the chemist design a special kind of oil resin that would burn, and they were going to pour it into the exposed tissue, right? So they had these special instruments made. They had a special oil, like a wax. He was gonna have to hold these wax candles, and then they were gonna pour, after they opened up the muscles, they were gonna pour this boiling liquid, kind of like a boiling acid, into his muscles and onto his bones. And then they were going to put him on this cart, and they were going to take him to this public. This is all public. It was a public execution. They, you know, bring your kids, right? And they were going to take him to this public place, and then they were going to tie his arms and legs up to horses and rip his arms and legs and horses off. and then they were going to throw the stump of the body onto a bunch of burning wood and light him on fire. That's what they were going to do to him. Now, the first thing to know about this is that the first 4 pages that Foucault is kind of narrating this story, these aren't Foucault's words, right? Foucault, at some point, when he was at the College of Paris, went to the archives. Foucault went to the archives, way down underground, and found newspaper, literally. Found newspaper report, literally. They have archived these newspapers from the 1700s, right? And found newspapers that documented or reported the event. So the first 4 pages that you're reading aren't Foucault's words. They're actual kind of cut and paste or paraphrasing from actual newspaper reports about the execution of Damien, which, by the way, is fascinating, because if whatever the execution was, and when we read it, we think this is grotesque and this is barbaric, this is horrific, right? It's shocking to us, right? And it's intended to be shocking. When you read the first 4 pages, right, you think, my God, what they do to this guy, it's barbaric, it's inhumane, it's grotesque, right? And the whole time it's kind of running through our brain, through thinking to ourselves, who in their right minds thought that this was a good thing to do as punishment or otherwise, right? So we read this and it's grotesque to us, and we're shocked by it, right? We think it's barbaric. We think it's inhumane and barbaric and disrespectful and grotesque. And we think, and the whole time we're thinking to ourselves as we read this, who in their right minds thought this was a good idea, right? And what's fascinating about this is the first 4 pages are newspaper accounts. Literally, Foucault is paraphrasing actual accounts of the execution. So some beat reporter for the Sun newspaper, right, got sent by his or her editor down to City Hall to cover the execution of this dude named Damien, right? So, you know, it was just a job, a day in the life of this reporter covering City Hall, which is fascinating. Again, that's fascinating, right? If you read the first 4 pages, they read like a kind of report, like someone from the LA Times goes to the city, you know, the city council meeting and kind of writes up a report of what they did. It reads like a report, right? The person who wrote the report, the reporter, the little journalist who wrote up the story, there were a couple stories Foucault uses about the vicious execution. They're just writing it up like it's normal, right? They're just reporting. This is just another execution. This is just another torture. All right. So Damien tries to kill the king. The king represents the kind of symbol of power. The king's body represents the body of the state. And for all intents and purposes, Damien has tried to kill the king and tried to kill the state. And according to this account of punishment and power and political power and punishment, then they're gonna torture him viciously and execute him and destroy his body. They're gonna turn his body to ash. So the whole power of the state is going to come crashing down on Damien, as a sign of power, as a sign of authority, as a kind of sign to all the people publicly gathered what not to do. Hey, don't be so damn stupid to try to kill the king, because if you do, this is what we're going to do to you. All right? It's public torture designed to convey a message. So So the event happens, and like I said, they had special pincers made, right, to pull back the flesh. They had special oil, this acid that they were going to pour in. They collected the horses that they were going to use to rip his arms and legs off. Had the fire ready to go, the whole thing. And we're reading this like it's some just Sunday picnic. It's a public event. So Foucault is telling this story. And again, by the way, that he's using this to demonstrate a kind of discourse. This is what punishment was. Right? Someone named Damien, I have no idea who the hell he was, didn't matter. He was obviously a peasant. There's no history of him, there's no record of him, there's no child development reports of him, there's no grade school grades of him. It's just this peasant, this invisible peasant, who for whatever reason, and we don't know the reason because no one bothered to fucking ask him because no one cared, right? No one cared why he did it. No one asked him. No one asked him because no one cared. Didn't matter. Some peasant, for some reason, decided to do the extraordinarily stupid thing of attacking the king and therefore attacking the body politic, the power in this kind of discourse. And as punishment goes in this discourse, they're going to torture him viciously, what we would call barbarically, grotesquely. And it was all planned out. Like I said, they had special instruments, pincers, because they really wanted to pull the flesh apart perfectly. They went down to the pharmacist and they said, cook me up, the chemist, the pharmacist, the apothecary, cook me up this oil, this resin, this acid that we're going to pour, we're going to melt it and we're going to pour into his bones. And go find me some strong horses so we can rip this guy's arms and legs off. And make sure everybody's there. Right? This is public. This is a public torture. So do it on a Sunday. Make sure everybody's there and bring the kids. So everybody sees what happens when you do something stupid like this. And it was reported by some beat reporter from the Sundial, just like it was like he or she was covering another city council meeting. And then what happens? This is the best part of the whole book. What happens? What happens? Well, a couple things happen. First, for whatever reason, the special instruments that they had made for this event, the pincers, aren't sharp enough or fine enough to really pull the flesh in the way they want. The instruments start to fail. Two, apparently, the special resin or wax or acid that they had specially ordered to melt and have boiling and to pour kept cooling. It would cool too quickly. It wouldn't stay all melted and hot and volcanic. It melted. So the pincers failed. The special acid kept cooling and hardening. My favorite, the horses that they got to rip off his limbs. For whatever reason, couldn't rip off the limbs, couldn't rip off the legs. And in fact, one horse gave up, one horse collapsed. And they had to call in the butcher. So they let the horses go, and they called in the local butcher with this big fucking kind of meat hacking fucking Jason kind of Freddy Krueger sort of thing. And he comes in there and he hacks up the fucking limbs because the horses collapsed. And even after they rip off his limbs and he's sitting there, he's still speaking. And while this whole thing is going on, several times, the local priest, several times throughout this catastrophe of torture, the local priest comes up to him and asks him if he wants to sort of make amends, right? If he wants to say to the priest, whisper to the priest, I'm sorry, forgive me, I've done wrong. Several times, the priest comes up asking for Damien's kind of repentance. And every time Damien refuses. And finally, they put the body on the wood and they light it on fire and they turn it to ash. Now, Foucault uses this kind of story as a vehicle, obviously for a discourse, obviously for a specific account of punishment and torture, right? This is how you punish people, and this is what you did with them, as well as a kind of metaphor for an entire system of political power and societal power. And also he tells the story because it illuminates what goes wrong. It illuminates how, in a way, this discourse, this feudal aristocratic discourse, is failing and kind of fading away, right? And so the takeaway here is that the king had this plan. They had this plan about how to torture them during Damien. And there was a purpose to the torture, to extract from Damien some kind of apology, some kind of repentance. And if you look at what happens, the whole system breaks down. The instruments, the technologies, the instruments and the technologies that they create to accomplish the torture break down. Again, the pincers don't work. The acid keeps cooling. It doesn't stay melted. The horses can't rip the limbs off. One horse collapses, right? The instruments and the technologies of power that are brought to bear in this process of punishment / torture fail. They fail. The instruments and the technologies of this discourse fail. And they fail publicly, right? People are now watching the king's instruments, the king's power, the king's technologies for this torture fail. And in fact, as Foucault kind of reports, it went so badly on a kind of material, technological, instrumental sort of way. It went so badly that many people started to feel sorry for Damien, right? They started to feel bad for him. I mean, imagine a torture going so bad that it's worse than being tortured, right? It's funny. right? And so they start to feel bad for him. And then two, equally, if not more importantly, not only do the instruments and the technologies fail and fail publicly, but the moral and political purpose of the torture, the moral and political purpose of the torture fail. Several times the priest goes up and says, do you want to make amends? Do you want to, repent? Do you want to say you're sorry? Do you want to acknowledge your guilt or your wrongdoing or the moral dimension, the political dimension of the torture fails, right? Because Damien never says, I'm sorry. He never repents. And if Damien never repents, then the whole moral and political purpose of the torture fails. The whole purpose, the moral and the political purpose of the torture is to extract from Dorian the recognition, Damien Dorian is my son's name, Dorian, oh my God, to extract from Damien, right, this repentance, right, this sense of moral guilt. And not just a sense of moral guilt, but a reauthorization of the king's authority, the king's power, the king's legitimacy. But Damien doesn't repent. And so the torture fails in extracting moral responsibility, and it fails in reasserting the sort of hierarchy and the legitimacy of the king's power. So Foucault tells this story about the execution as a kind of metaphor for an entire discourse, this what he loosely calls this feudal aristocratic discourse, built around the visibility of the king, the invisibility of Damien, the use of the specific techniques to destroy the body for the purposes of certain moral and political reauthorizations. Right? He tells this whole story. One, to demonstrate how fundamentally different it is, and say more about that in just a second, and how it fails. Right? The instruments and the moral conditions of this punishment. If you think of the torture and the execution as a kind of punishment, break down. The instruments can't destroy the body. And because the instruments can't or don't destroy the body, Damien doesn't have the effect, doesn't have the moral and political effect on him. And so Foucault uses this as a kind of just a playful metaphor for the breakdown of a kind of discourse. The discourse can't do what it wants to do. It wants to torture this body, but the pincers don't work, the wax cools, the horses collapse, right? It's a catastrophe. And the discourse fails because it fails to achieve its moral and political purpose. The discourse is failing. Right? And it fails publicly. And this whole time that we're watching this and we're reading this, and again, like I said earlier, we in the back of our minds or in the front of our minds, we're thinking to ourselves, God, this is grotesque, this is barbaric, right? Who would think that this was a good thing to do? And Foucault is reminding us, right, that from the point of view of the people, of the king, of the executioners, of the people watching the execution, of the journalists reporting the execution, from the point of view of this discourse, from the point of view of this discourse and the people in it, it wasn't barbaric at all. It wasn't grotesque until it went really weird, but it wasn't barbaric, it wasn't grotesque, it wasn't a human rights violation, it wasn't inhumane, it was a fully normal thing, right? And And when we were talking earlier about kind of discourses having their own internal set of logics and meanings and values, this is kind of what we're talking about. From the point of view of this particular discourse, right, there was nothing barbaric or inhumane or unjust or irreligious about it. In fact, the torture was part of a discourse, right? The sentence, the torture, and the execution were morally and religiously sanctioned, right? They were morally and religiously sanctioned. Several times the priest comes up to Damien and says, "Are you ready to say you're sorry?" The priest, the Catholic priest, right? Not once does the priest say, "Oh, this is horrific," or "This is barbaric," or "This is no way to treat God's children." Not once. The torture was religiously sanctioned. The Catholic Church in this particular moment, in this particular discourse, said, "Yeah, that's a fucking great thing to do. We're behind this. Yeah, we've got no problem with this." It was morally and religiously sanctioned. The execution was legally and politically sanctioned. Obviously, the king ordered it. It was socially accepted. The people accepted this until they started not to, because it was getting kind of really grotesque. But it was legally and politically sanctioned. The king mobilized the best technology and instruments he could have created to do this. It was normal. This is what the technology permitted. The execution was totally normal. And again, in this kind of funny way, it was covered by the journalists who wrote the story for the paper as a totally normal event. You don't get the sense when you're reading the passages Foucault provides, written by these journalists who watched and reported and wrote about the execution. You don't get the sense that it was some grotesque, horrific, barbaric moment in human history. Just the opposite. It's, hey, and 8:05, the cart rolled up, and Damien, he was kind of tied up, and people were gathered, and they started ripping the flesh apart, and that didn't go so well. But then they tried the acid, right? And then the horses were pulled in, and 2 horses collapsed. It's like something you'd read in the sundial. It's a report. Some beat reporter reporting on some editor sent this reporter down to cover the story. Write up a story. We got a deadline for tomorrow's paper. So this was the punishment, and the execution had its own logic. It had its own internally verifiable system of meanings, values, and purposes. It had its own logic. But the discourse breaks down in a way because it can't do anymore what it needs to do. Right? It fails. It's kind of coming apart. And Foucault tells this story for a couple of reasons. One, to juxtapose for us how radically different discourses can be, right? And how, no matter how grotesque we on our Enlightenment side of punishment and rationality and humanity think it was totally normal to these people, had its own logic, morally, religiously sanctioned, but it broke down. Couldn't do anymore what it was intended to do. And so, in this brilliant way, he narrates this 4 pages of this torture, and then the narrative stops and abruptly shifts to this kind of schedule of the boys' home. Right? Shifts to this account of what happens in a boys' home. 8 a.m., get up, 8:15, brush your teeth, 8:30, put your clothes on, 8:45, say a prayer, 9 o'clock, have breakfast, 9:30, meet for educate. What, it's just the schedule, the Enlightenment schedule in the boys' home, designed to produce certain types of aptitude and behavior. Right? And I think at the most, so I forget what the date for the boys' home was, but the time between the execution of Damien was still late. It was in the 1750s, right? Which is still kind of late in a weird way. The Enlightenment is well underway in various parts of the world. It's well underway in France, but you still have this vestige of this kind of discourse that's hanging around. But it faded away and emerged and kind of emerged, came the Enlightenment with this kind of example that Foucault is talking about of the boys' home, right? And so as one discourse kind of fails, another emerges, right? And within 80 years, there's only 80 years that separates the execution of Damien from the emergence of this fully functioning Enlightenment kind of disciplinary power boys' home. Of course, and the boys' home is a kind of metaphor for the emergence of the Enlightenment discourse, and ultimately what Foucault will call disciplinary power. Right? And there's no rational kind of justifications for the emergence of one. Right? Now, to be sure, from the Enlightenment point of view, we tell ourselves that story. Yeah, we became more humane. We became more free. We became more rational. Yeah, we tell ourselves that story, of course. Right? But what really is happening, Foucault says, is that during this time, from the 1600s all the way up to kind of where we are now, there is emerging a new discourse. There's an Enlightenment. There's a whole new series of ideas, philosophical ideas about people. Hey, people are free. All human life has a kind of inherent moral dignity and equality. People have natural rights. You're right. I mean, it's only what? When's the US Constitution written? 1789? Right? It's about 30 years after the execution of Damien that the US Constitution is written. And there's an actual right, one of the Bills of Rights against cruel and unusual punishment. A new law shows up. It's illegal kind of to torture people. And what Foucault is talking about is during this time, slowly, but emerging more and more across various kind of intellectual disciplines, there emerges the Enlightenment. A whole new set of philosophical ideas about people. Hey, people are free. And all life has a kind of moral dignity, an equal moral dignity. And people have rights. There's just some things you shouldn't do to them. And they're emerging this kind of new cycle, these kind of normative social and behavioral sciences, right? The criminologists emerge, right? The sociologists emerge, the psychiatrists emerge, right? And they're interested in knowing why things happen, right? Okay, the modern prison starts to emerge, right? The feudal aristocratic discourse, with its focus on this grotesque, what we call grotesque, barbaric, inhumane, unjust torture, gives way to what? The Enlightenment, with new philosophical and scientific ideas about human beings, with new legal and political ideas about how people are treated, the emergence of new intellectual ideas about knowledge, right? This whole Enlightenment kind of discourse emerges. And you see you see, and Foucault will use in the book, the emergence of this new Enlightenment notion of punishment as a vehicle to show how these strategies are developed for the prison. And not just strategies and techniques developed for the prison, but most importantly, to rehabilitate the prisoner. Right? Now the goal in the Enlightenment, the goal of punishment and the prison and the Enlightenment, it's not to torture and destroy the body, right? It's to kind of incarcerate and rehabilitate the criminal so he or she can be put back in society to be made productive again. So a whole new discourse emerges about what punishment is and what rehabilitation is, right? In the Enlightenment. And it uses these kind of three technologies. But those technologies are so good at doing what they're supposed to do that they are deployed throughout the entire society. They're deployed in hospitals, in elementary schools, in universities, in factories, and bureaucracies. So the techniques and the technologies designed that emerge in the Enlightenment, as the Enlightenment reimagines punishment and rehabilitation, the techniques and strategies that were developed and designed for that project get deployed throughout society entirely. So the Enlightenment represents the end of torture as a kind of discourse, the end of this feudal aristocratic discourse about torture, right? And it ushers in the age of rehabilitation. And so the point here, as we move from the torture to the boys' home and then to the book itself, that with the Enlightenment, we see the emergence of new philosophical, normative, social and behavioral, scientific, and legal and political ideas that lead to the disappearance of public torture and lead to a kind of emphasis on rehabilitation and the reversal of visibility. Now, to be sure, the people that were part of this project, right, this Enlightenment project, the philosophers and the social scientists and the political theorists, all of those people that were part of this project, they themselves think they're doing, they themselves, just like we still in a weird way, they themselves thought they were doing something objectively true and good, of course, right? Locke was talking about natural right theory. Hobbes is talking about natural right theory. The French Enlightenment political theorists are talking about limited government, about human freedom, right? The social scientists are talking about, science, cognitive and behavioral and social science. They think they're engaged in some kind of metaphysical project, of course. But from Foucault's postmodern point of view, this is yet the emergence of a new discourse that will, at the end of the day, reconstitute meaning, value, and purpose as a kind of discursive project. All right, we will pick this up on Tuesday. We will unpack really what's going on in this new project, and it will look much like us. Right, the second part, or the last 2/3 of chapter 1, should be very familiar because it's us. Foucault is describing us. We are the army of technicians Foucault describes in chapter 1. All right, so have a great weekend. We will pick this up on Tuesday, and then we will continue. Have a great day, you guys.
You too, Professor.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Nick.